Today in Tarkir Dragonstorm, we get a Mythic Sultai Wrath, one of the best Panharmonicon creatures that I've ever seen, a 3-drop that can potentially kill your opponent in a single attack, and so much more. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffrada, and it's time for another daily dose of Tarkir Dragonstorm spoilers. So we've officially reached the end of week 1 of spoiler season. It's Saturday, no spoilers tomorrow. The good news is, we got a whole nother week of spoilers to go. Plus, today we have some super sweet cards to talk about, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new Tarkir Dragonstorm cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Tarkir Dragonstorm. First up today, we get a new Mythic Sultai Wrath in Death Begets Life. So it is an 8-mana Sultai sorcery. This is destroy all creatures and enchantments, and then draw a card for each permanent destroyed this way. So Death Begets Life. It is incredibly powerful, but also incredibly expensive. It's basically an upgraded Decree of Pain. A Decree of Pain 8 mana blows up everything. You get the upside of cycling. Death Begets Life. You get the upside of essentially having a Back to Nature stapled onto your Decree of Pain, getting rid of all the enchantments as well as all the creatures, and there's no doubt that this card is very powerful. If you think about our current standard format, most decks are winning with creatures in one way or another, so Wrath and creatures is going to be good in most matchups, and then enchantments are a really important part of the metagame. Between all this self-bounce hopeless nightmare stuff, decks driven by Caretaker's talent, Innkeeper's talent, engines like Unholy Annex up the Beanstalk, a lot of standard decks are going to have at least one and some more very important enchantments, and being able to get rid of everything is really, really strong. The problem is, the card is a ton of mana. If you run into an aggro deck, this is like the worst Wrath in the format. If you're running a mono red or some sort of Convoke deck or Lizards, you're just going to die before you ever get to cast this card. So it's definitely not a replacement for playing Deadly Cover-Up, for playing a Day of Judgment, for playing these cheaper Wraths, because it's just so much mana. I think this card, though, can serve a purpose in Standard. I think this is a card for specific decks. If you're playing like a 5-color or a Sultai Ramp deck, I actually think this card could be a pretty solid one of, maybe in the main deck, maybe in the sideboard. Works well with Overlord of the Hauntwoods, Doppelgang, of course, Invasion is Zendikar, where being able to blow up everything and refill your hand is probably going to win you the game. So the question is, can your deck realistically cast this card by like turn 5? If the answer is yes, then this card's probably busted. If the answer is no, then you should probably just play another sweeper in your deck. As far as Commander is concerned, it's very much a Decree of Pain, and Decree of Pain is still a card that I play in quite a few decks. I've kind of went back and forth on it. Sometimes it feels a little bit too expensive, but then sometimes you cast it and you blow up the board and also draw like 10 cards, and it feels like a game-winning finisher almost. So I think this is a card that, because it's in Sultai, and because you're going to have green mana, is actually a card I'll play quite a bit in Commander when I happen to be in its colors, just because you're in green, and if you're playing green, you get this absurd ramp. Nature's Lore 3 visits open the way, where an 8-mana sorcery in a green Commander deck is actually like a 5-mana sorcery in most other colors, because you just ramp so incredibly well. So the mana cost really doesn't scare me because of how I build my green decks. That said, it's still going to be in its best in decks that are focused on ramping. If you're like a Mana Dork deck or your Sultai deck that's not ramping, like a Graveyard deck without much ramp, it gets a lot worse. But if you're playing like Tevils or Roxas, Monandina, these rampy style Sultai to Commanders, I think this is an easy inclusion. I'm not replacing my Damnation or my Toxic Deluge or whatever. I'm probably replacing my Decree of Pain, honestly, because I don't think the cycling mode is that much upside. So it's going to be in my expensive Wrath slot, but I still think it's going to make a cut a lot of the time. So Death Begets Life, kind of expensive for Standard, although it could still serve a purpose in the right deck, in the right meta. But in Commander, I actually really like this card, and I think I'll play it in a lot of decks. We also got a sweet new Abzan rare in Yathan Roadwatcher. So Yathan Roadwatcher, a 4-mana 3/3 human scout. It says when it enters, if you cast it, you can mill 4 cards, and when you do, you return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So worth pointing out here, you return any creature from your graveyard with mana value 3 or less, not just creatures from the 4 cards that you mailed, which is a nice upside here compared to some recent versions of this effect we've seen. So Yathan Roadwatcher, there's not a perfect comparison for this card, kind of reminiscent of Sevine's Reclamation, Sultai, though obviously you only get back creatures, you can't get back other cheap permanents. Also kind of similar to Zorleen, except it does it for free. Zorleen, you gotta pay some mana, you gotta pay some life, although the two cards could work pretty well together. Maybe there's some sort of like grindy Abzan deck where you can like Roadwatcher to get back your Zorleen, Zorleen to get back something else, and you just rebuild your board from the graveyard. So it's gonna be interesting to see if maybe there's some sort of like Abzan graveyard grind deck in Standard. Another comparison, and bear with me on this one because it's not obvious on first glance, but it kind of reminds me of Collected Company in a weird way. So if you think about Collected Company, you cast it for 4 mana, you in theory should get 2 3-drops, hopefully. Yathan Roadwatcher, you cast it for 4 mana, you're going to get a 3/3, which is itself, and then you're hopefully going to get an additional creature, which will kind of make it play like a Coco, except one of your hits is always going to be this like vanilla 3/3, which is Yathan Roadwatcher, which I think is still a pretty powerful effect. We're in a very removal-heavy Standard, and cards that just add multiple bodies to the battlefield tend to be very good in a meta like that. Plus, we're in a Standard with some absurd 3-drops. Obviously, you get back anything mana value 3 or less with Roadwatcher, but it's going to be at its best when you get back a 3-drop. That's the max value you can get out of this card. So imagine Roadwatcher into Preacher of the Schism, or Skirmish Rhino, Glissa Sunslayer, Enduring Innocence, Enduring Vitality. There's so many good hits here that I think there's definitely the possibility of a very strong Abzan deck in Standard where Roadwatcher is an easy 4 of in that deck. The one thing that I should mention about this card, and the biggest downside, is its ability only triggers when you cast it, which means you can't really blink it and get value out of it. You can't really reanimate it and get value out of it. So keep that in mind. I guess it keeps it from being too busted, but that is a big drawback in some decks. As far as Commander is concerned, I actually don't know if I would play this card in most decks. I love Sevine's Reclamation and Sun Titan, but a huge part of the power of those cards is you can get back any permanent mana value 3 or less, which means worst case, you get back a fetch land, and it's essentially like a weird ramp spell. Yathan Roadwatcher, I'm just not sure it's going to hit enough. I don't know if my decks play enough creatures with mana value 3 or less for me to consistently hit something with this. And then plus, you could be 1 more mana and have like a Karmic Guide and just reanimate anything from your graveyard. So I actually think this is much more of a Standard card than a Commander card. But I guess if you're like an Abzan deck that's playing a ton of mana dorks and a ton of cheap creatures, and you care about your graveyard, maybe like a Bilbo deck because you have all the Soul Sisters and so forth, which tend to be cheap creatures, maybe there's a specific deck where it can work. But honestly, weirdly, I feel like this is one that is designed way more for 60 card formats than it actually is to be good in Commander. Next up, we get a new black 3-drop in Avenger of the Fallen. So Avenger of the Fallen, a 3-mana 2/4 death-touching human warrior with Mobilize X, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So essentially, a 3-mana 2/4 Death Toucher that when it attacks, you get a 1/1 red warrior creature token that's tapped and attacking for each creature in your graveyard, which means this is an incredibly high ceiling card. Like, if you have 20 creatures in your graveyard, this could just be one-shotting your opponent, but it's also a relatively low floor card, which honestly might not be that fair. Its ability is low floor. If your graveyard gets shut down or you have nothing in your graveyard, it's not really going to do anything, but I guess its floor isn't really that bad because it's still a 2/4 Death Toucher, which we've actually seen be a pretty good body in current Standard in Preacher of the Schism. So if you want a comparison for this card, it's kind of like a Preacher of the Schism mixed with, I guess, Kessig Cage Breakers, although Cage Breakers, way more mana, but you get to keep 2/2 tokens forever. Avenger of the Fallen, you only get to keep the tokens for a turn, but still you can make a lot of them for just 3 mana. So let's start with the bad news of this card, which is if you're just playing a generic deck, let's say you're playing Dimir midrange, maybe Golgari midrange, maybe Mono Black in Standard, I'm not convinced that I would play this over Preacher of the Schism. Preacher of the Schism's card draw mode is actually way more powerful than its vampire making mode. It's nice that you get both of those options, but the real power of Preacher is drawing an extra card each turn. So I feel like Preacher in a generic deck is just going to be better. Avenger of the Fallen never going to draw you a card. Plus, in the early game, it might not do anything. If you go turn 1, whatever, tap land, into turn 2 Deep Cavern Bat, into turn 3 Avenger of the Fallen, you get a 2/4 Death Toucher, but you don't have anything in your graveyard to really trigger off of it. So in a vacuum, in a generic deck that's not built around Mobilize, not built around Avenger of the Fallen at all, I think it's a worse Preacher of the Schism. But there's a lot of good news with this card, which is in the right deck, this is way more busted than Preacher of the Schism. So what kind of deck wants to use Avenger of the Fallen. So obviously, works really well in a mobilized deck. We kind of see the Mardu package from Tarkir Dragonstorm being about mobilizing. You got Zurgo to keep your tokens around. You got Narrative to double the damage of your hasty tokens when they come into play. So in a deck like that, toss in some graveyard synergies to stock your graveyard a bit, maybe Overlord of the Hollowmurk, and then all of a sudden, you have a pretty powerful effect. It's not like you need to make 20 tokens with this. I mean, if this is making 3 tokens, 4 tokens, that's already kind of an insane card for 3 mana, so seems really good in like Mardu mobilized decks. It also is sneakily powerful in sacrifice decks, and that might be my favorite home for this card. We've played some aristocrat style decks in Standard. We got like LSL Core, Vengeful Blood Witch, is Blood Artist effects, you get sack outlets like a Bart. Avenger of the Fallen seems so perfect here because these decks tend to get creatures in the graveyard. They're often playing Raise the Past, so they're trying to fill their graveyard, and then Avenger of the Fallen will make a bunch of tokens, and those tokens are going to sacrifice themselves on your end step, which is going to be a ton of triggers for Vengeful Blood Witch, for LSL Core. Plus, if you have like Bart out, you can sack them to the Bart to get counters on your Bart instead. So it seems like a really synergistic piece for some sort of graveyardy aristocrat style deck. It also is pretty cute in like some sort of Mardu, Monument, Alicia style deck. You got Fear missing out. There's a bunch of these cheap red creatures that can just get stuff in your graveyard. Alicia gets stuff back. You're discarding stuff to trigger Monument. And then Avenger of the Fallen, just kind of a finisher. If you're a deck that can get a bunch of creatures in your graveyard, this offers a ton of damage. It's a 3-drop that could be attacking for like 10 a turn or something thanks to Mobilize. In Commander, I think the same story is mostly true. I would not just play this in a generic deck. It really wants to be in some sort of sack deck or like self-mill style deck. It seems great with like Elenda the Dusk Rose, for example. Elenda, yeah, I know it's kind of a vampire commander, but really it's like an aristocrat style commander. Whenever another creature dies, you get a counter on it, and then it makes a bunch of vampires when it dies. Avenger of the Fallen seems perfect here. You attack with it, you make a bunch of these mobilized tokens that are going to sack to grow your Elenda, or like Braids, you can make the tokens and sack them to Braids to get value out of it. Basically, if you're some sort of graveyard deck that wants to play a card like Blood Artist, then I think you're probably at least considering Avenger of the Fallen. The other place it's kind of insane is in token deck. So maybe the best synergy for this card in Commander is just Mirkwood Bats. Mirkwood Bats, whenever another token enters or is sacrificed, each opponent loses a life. Avenger of the Fallen hits on both sides of that. You attack with it, that's a bunch of tokens entering, your opponent's going to lose a bunch of life, and then all those tokens are going to sacrifice themselves, your opponent's going to lose a bunch more life. So if you're a Mirkwood Bat deck, maybe Chatterfang or Caesar, then I think Avenger of the Fallen probably going to be really good there as well. The final home is just in self-mill style decks. So in self-mill style decks like Disa or Corridor or Sidisi, yeah, you're probably not going to have the Blood Artists to do those weird sacrifice shenanigans, but what you do get is a deck that's built to stock your graveyard, and the more creatures you get in the graveyard, the more tokens that Avenger of the Fallen's going to make. So in the context of a deck that's just built to get as many creatures in the graveyard as possible, then I like Avenger of the Fallen, even if you don't have a bunch of synergies for it, just as a raw power card. So Avenger of the Fallen, I love this design. I think this card can see standard play in the right deck. I don't know if it beats out Preacher of the Schism in a generic deck, but this card has such cool synergies, and its ceiling is incredibly high, thanks to the number of tokens it can make when things go well. Moving into the world of Jeskai, we got a super sweet one in Flamehold Grappler. So Flamehold Grappler, when I first read this card, I thought it kind of sucked, and then I read it again, and I still thought it kind of sucked, but the third time I read it, I understood what was going on. I was like, oh my god, I actually love this card. So it's a 3-mana Jeskai 3/3 human monk with first strike. It says, when this creature enters, copy the next spell you cast this turn. When you cast it, you may choose new targets for the copy. So Flamehold Grappler, when I first read this card, I was like, all right, it's a fork, it's a Twinferno, it's a teach by example. On a creature, I guess that's kind of cool, but if I want to copy a spell, I can just do it cheaper with a ton of other cards. But then I read it again, I was like, wait a minute, this copies any spell. This isn't just instant or sorcery spells. And then it struck me that this card's actually kind of insane, and we've never actually seen a card like this in Magic. I couldn't find an effect that was relatively inexpensive and copy the next any spell you cast, not just instant or sorcery spell, you know, with like Lithomantic Engine or whatever, but that's so much mana. So this is just the new cheapest way to copy anything, and that got me very excited about this card, because I thought it was a bad Spellslinger card, but it's not a bad Spellslinger card, it's an insane Panharmonicon card. I don't want to be copying spells with this. I want to have an Elvish Nord or a Panharmonicon or a Virtual Knowledge, and I play this and double trigger it, and then I play the next thing, and I get 3 copies of it, and that thing probably has an ETB that's going to trigger all the Panharmonicons, and it's going to be absolutely wild. So in any sort of Panharmonicon shell, I feel like this is one of the new best creatures you can ever play in that deck. Yes, you do need a bunch of mana because you got to cast a 3-drop and follow it up with another spell, but when you do it, the amount of value you are going to get is going to be overwhelming. It's also a great blink card. This doesn't have a if you cast it restriction on it, which we've seen with some other cards in this set. So that means you can like play a Flamehold Grappler and then Ephemerate. You'll get 2 Ephemerates. You can blink the Flamehold Grappler and something else for value, and then that Flamehold Grappler will trigger. If you cast another spell, you get to copy it. So once you start blinking it, the value just becomes overwhelming super quick. The other trick with this card is it's a way that you can turn anything into a token. And why would you want to turn things into a token? And the answer is most decks you wouldn't. But if you're playing maybe 3 Blind Mice, it's very powerful to turn it into a token, because then you can copy itself with its 2nd and 3rd lore counter. Caretaker's Talent, you can turn it into a token, and then you can copy it with its 2nd level. So some shenanigans like that seem very strong with this card. Imagine like turn 6, Flamehold Grappler, you get a 3/3 first striker, which is a fine body, follow it up with a Caretaker's Talent, which will copy in token form to get another Caretaker's Talent, and then you're just off to the races. So I think that this card is actually one of my favorites in the set, which is really funny because I was fully prepared to trash this card. The other use of this card I can see in Standard is it's cute with the Harmonize mechanic. You can like play your Flamehold Grappler and then harmonize Winter Night Stories, tapping the Grappler to reduce its cost, get 2 copies of it, draw a ton of cards. So it's another cute little shenanigan. The downside of this card is, if you think of it as a spell copying card, it's not very good. Like, if you're just copying spells, there's better ways to do it, like Dual Caster Mage, for example, which can copy your opponent's spells and has combo potential. The combos you can do with Dual Caster are dependent on it having haste, so you can't do the combos with Flamehold Grappler, even if you have the right spell in hand. I guess you could if you had, like, a Leyline of Anticipation or Vidalcan or some other way to give Grappler haste, but in general, it's just bad Dual Caster Mage if you're copying spells, and in Commander, copying spells is really easy. Like, if you just care about instants or sorceries, you got Reverberates and Increasing Vengeances and Forks. There's so many more efficient ways to get the job done. So I think the story in Commander is similar to how I see it in 60 card formats, where I'm most excited to play this card in Blink decks and Panharmonicon decks. So Ziana, maybe if you're playing a Omnath Locus of Creation deck with a bunch of Panharmonicons, Parmicon Sky Rampart tends to be a Blink deck, and the new Shuko also seems very good. It kind of cares about the same thing, copying a bunch of spells, so it fits the theme there very well. The biggest issue I have with this card in Commander is the issue I've had with a lot of the 3-color cards, which is they just can't go in a lot of decks because of color identity. There's a ton of like Yarok decks or Brago decks that I love to play Flamehold Grappler in, but I just can't because it's too many colors to fit in those decks. So that's going to reduce the number of decks I can put it in. But if I'm playing a Jeskai up to 5-color Panharmonicon style deck or Blink style deck, you better bet this card is going to be in it because it seems absolutely ridiculous. We also got a new Mana Rock, but it happens to be green for some reason. The color that really loves Mana Rock. Really loves Mana Rocks. Herd Heirloom. So it's a 2-mana artifact. It taps to make a mana of any color, but you can only spend it on creature spells, or you can tap it and make it until end of turn. Target creature you control with power 4 or greater gains trample, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So Herd Heirloom, it's a pretty interesting effect. As a Mana Rock, it's pretty bad. Like, we had Pillar of Origins a while ago, which I guess has an additional restriction of only making mana for a creature of a certain type, but really a Mana Rock that only makes mana for creatures, in triply sowing green, where you don't really want to play Mana Rocks, period, is just not a very good effect. So if this card's going to work, I'm expecting it's probably going to mostly be a Commander card, but if it's going to work, I think it's actually going to be because you can get some value out of the mana, but really you can get value out of this second ability where you get to draw a card and trample up a big threat. So in Standard, I imagine you could try to play like herd Heirloom into a powerful 4-drop like Axebane Ferox or Anzarag, or it's brutal with Magmatic Hellkite. Imagine turn 2 herd Heirloom, turn 3 Hellkite, blow up one of your lands, you replace it with a stun counter land, and they have a 4/5 fire that I can start drawing cards with next turn with herd Heirloom. Or Hulking Raptor, turn 2 Heirloom into turn 3 Raptor, into turn 4, I don't know, some ungodly 7-drop dinosaur. So those are the kind of shenanigans I'd be looking for with this card. It's also kind of hilarious with Jumbo Cactuar. Like, Jumbo Cactuar, everyone loves this card. It's not even out yet and everyone loves this card, but it really needs to have trample to do anything. And this is a great way to give it trample and make sure your 1,000 damage is actually going to get through. So those are some of the uses of this card. Although really, I'm not sure how many standard decks I would play this in. In Commander, the big problem I have is I don't want to play Mana Rocks in my green deck, period. If anything, I want to avoid accidentally playing Mana Rocks in my green deck so I can play Bane of Progress and cards like that that punish other people for playing Mana Rocks. So because this is directly competing with Nature's Lore 3 Visits, Rampant Growth, Farseek, Secure Tribe Elder, Explore, there's like a huge list of 2-mana ramp spells. I would never play this as a ramp spell, period. However, the last mode is kind of interesting, especially in a Voltron-y style deck. If you're playing like Omnath Locust of Mana, or Igra Eater of All, maybe Gargos, or Rafik, or Yargle and Multani, having this card that is like a bad ramp spell that's also going to be able to trample up your big Voltron commander and even draw you an extra card seems like a pretty powerful effect. So I almost view this card in a weird way like a charm. Think of a charm and how if you read a charm, any individual mode on the charm looks kind of meh, but the power of the card is you mash all those modes together and you get all this flexibility out of the card. I feel like Herd Heirloom is the same way. Both individual modes I'm kind of meh on, and I think the second mode is actually the stronger of the two, but when you mash them together and you have a card that like, okay, it can ramp me into Igra, and then I can trample up my Igra, you actually have something that might be kind of appealing. Plus, if you're a deck that has a bunch of big creatures, you can kind of turn it into a weird Phyrexian arena, like if every turn you're activating the second mode to give something trample and let you draw a card, that's actually pretty powerful. So Herd Heirloom, not really expecting this one to be big in standard, but I actually hope I'm wrong. If people are like trampling up their Jumbo Cactuars or Anzarags, that would be absolutely awesome. In Commander, as weird as it sounds, it might be worth playing in some decks. Like I said, I really hate green Mana Rocks, like really hate green Mana Rocks, but that second mode intrigues me enough that if I'm trying to do Voltron-y shenanigans in my green deck, I'm gonna at least consider this card in one of my ramp slots. Next on the list, we get Tersa Lightshatter, a 3-mana 3/3 red legendary orc wizard that has haste, and it says when it enters, you can discard up to 2 cards, then draw that many cards. So it does not do the, if you're empty-handed, I just draw you cards trick. You gotta discard the cards to draw them. And then when it attacks, if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you exile a card at random from your graveyard, and you may play that card this turn. So Tersa Lightshatter, this card's very interesting. It's a hasty 3-mana 3/3, which we've seen be pretty good in the recent past. Screaming Nemesis, Godric for a while, although just being a 3-mana 3/3, not enough to make a card good. You gotta have a big upside these days. We have Brazen Scourge in standard. No one plays that card. So a 3-mana 3/3 haster with an upside can be very standard playable. So the question for Tersa is its upside of discarding to draw and then maybe letting you cast a card from your graveyard eventually, is that enough to make it playable? And I think it might be. It actually reminds me a lot of like Red Kiora. Actually, it's very much Red Kiora, where Kiora, when it enters, you draw 2, then discard, which is better, right, than discarding, then drawing. And then you get an upside once you get Threshold, which is 7 or more cards in your graveyard. Kiora makes big octopuses. Tersa lets you cast cards from your graveyard. We've seen Kiora see play, and I think Tersa can do the same thing. If you're a deck that cares about discarding cards and cares about filling your graveyard, I think Tersa is a fine option. In standard, Monument to Endurance. You got Fear missing out. You got Inti. Now you got Tersa. Now I kind of just want to build Mono Red Monument. It seems like it actually could be a really sweet deck. The downside of this card is I don't think it's going to make it in traditional aggro decks. As weird as it sounds, I think Tersa is just too slow for the current mono red decks. They want to be killing you by the time you're actually just casting Tersa for value. Plus, if you're going to play a hasty 3/3, it's probably going to be Screaming Nemesis, so it's going to need a specific home. 5 years ago, this would be an insane mono red staple. Today, I'm like, maybe as a one of. It's wild just how much more powerful the game has gotten. The other thing notable about this card is if you get to 7 cards in your graveyard, the threshold mode, and you're able to exile a card and play it, it's going to go back into your graveyard. So it's kind of more of an Underworld Breach than a Snapcaster Mage in that way. So in theory, you could hit the same card multiple turns in a row, which could be good or bad depending on what the card is. That last mode, it's going to be very chaotic, but it is card advantage, right? Like, you get to play the card, which means if you hit a land, you can play it. If you hit a spell, you can cast it. You do have to spend mana on it, similar to Snapcaster Mage, but it is going to be nice value once you get a full graveyard. So I think in the right deck in Standard, a deck that's looking to fill the graveyard, that's looking to trigger Monument to Endurance, I think that Tersa can actually be very, very good. Not sure it makes it in mono red. In older formats, I don't really see the appeal, because once you get outside of Standard, you got Seasoned Pyromancer, which is mostly just better Tersa. It makes tokens with its Enters trigger. If you got no cards in hand, it draws you cards. It's also kind of competing directly with Fable the Mirror Breaker, which we've just seen be one of the best value 3-drops that has been printed in recent years. So I'm not sure it's actually going to beat out these cards in other formats. So Tersa seems like a fine Standard card. In Commander, I guess you could play it. I don't know. I don't play cards like this in Commander. I guess if you're like a mono red graveyard deck and want additional ways to stock your graveyard, it could be good. Some sort of like Reanimator strategy. Otherwise, it seems mostly like a Standard card to me, but it is a good one if you're in the right shell. We also got our Golgari Siege in Hollowmurk Siege. So Hollowmurk Siege, 2-mana enchantment. When it enters, you choose Sultai or Abzan. If you choose Sultai, whenever a counter is put on a creature you control, you draw a card, but only once each turn. If you choose Abzan, when you attack, you put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature, and it gets menace until end of turn. Also notable that if you draw multiples of these, they actually kind of work well together. Like, you play one of them, so you're able to draw cards when you get counters. You play the second one, and when you attack, you get to put a counter, which will trigger the first one to draw a card. So it is nice that drawing multiples of these is actually kind of powerful. So Mirkwood Siege, I think this card might actually be kind of good in an aggro deck or a +1/+1 counter deck. So its first mode, it's essentially like any creature you have on the battlefield is a Dusk Legion Zealot. Like, as long as you put a +1/+1 counter, or really any counter, doesn't even have to be +1/+1, but as long as you put a counter on some creature, you're going to get to draw a card once per turn. It does mean you can do it during your opponent's turn and draw another card if you have a way to do that. So that mode seems fine in a deck that's built around putting counters on things. I think the generic mode on this card, though, is Abzan. We saw not that long ago Ranger class be kind of busted. Is this 2-mana enchantment that once you get to level 2, whenever you attack, you put a +1/+1 counter on attacking creature. Abzan does the same thing, plus it gives the creature menace. So this is an incredibly scary aggro enchantment. If you go turn 1 1-drop, turn 2 Hollowmurk Siege, you're going to start growing and menacing that threat and getting through a ton of damage really early in the game. So I think this card looks very Standard playable in the right deck. I feel like I've said that a lot during this spoiler season. So what are the decks that would want this? Obviously, +1/+1 counter synergy decks. You play it like a card advantage engines, essentially. If you have an Innkeeper's Talent, you're going to put a counter on a creature each turn. You're going to draw a card each turn. If you can find a way to do it during your opponent's turn, you double up the value. So we have stuff like Innkeeper's Talent. We got Ozolith in Standard still. Sharp-Eyed Rookie. There's a ton of +1/+1 counter synergies, and Hollowmurk Siege seems perfect in those decks. It also just seems good because of Abzan in an aggro deck. Like I talked about before, turn 1, whatever, Spiteful Hexmage, Gas Guzzler, Llanowar Elves, turn 2 Hollowmurk Siege, start attacking with Abzan, getting counters, getting in damage. That's going to close out games really, really quickly. Plus, you can kind of just build your own even better Phyrexian Arena with stuff like Scavenging Ooze or Bristly Bill. These are the cards that are going to make it easiest to trigger this multiple times each turn cycle. So even though you can only trigger it once each turn, if you like Scavenging Ooze during your turn, get a counter, draw a card with the Sultai mode, go to your opponent's turn, activate Scavenging Ooze, get a counter, draw another card with the Sultai mode, you are quickly going to overwhelm your opponent with card advantage. Same with like Bristly Bill with its landfall trigger. Fetch lands can let you trigger it during your opponent's turn. So if you can build this into at least a Phyrexian Arena for 2 mana, it's already great. And if you're drawing each turn, including your opponent's turn, and you're getting a double Phyrexian Arena for 2 mana while you're growing your team, the card's actually kind of wild. As far as Commander, I think this card's very, very, very solid in +1/+1 counter theme decks. So we're just talking about Phyrexian Arena. I know a lot of people don't like Phyrexian Arena anymore. I'm still a very big Phyrexian Arena believer. I will play that in pretty much all my decks as a card advantage engine. In a +1/+1 counter theme deck, to me this looks like 2-mana Phyrexian Arena with a ton of upside. So it works really well with like Skullbriar, obviously, getting more counters, menacing it in, Atraxa, Wise Mothman, Cleopatra, Grakmaw. So in any +1/+1 counter theme deck, I'm definitely interested in this, with my plan being to put it on Sultai and turn it into at least a Phyrexian Arena, and hopefully even more if I can get some counters during my opponent's turn. So Hollowmurk Siege, it's only 2 mana. It's the cheapest Siege we've seen yet. Not gonna go in every deck, I don't think, but if you're like an aggro deck that's in Golgari or a +1/+1 counter deck, this card seems very scary. As far as lower rarity cards, there's a handful I think deserve a shout out today, starting with Sonic Shrieker. So Sonic Shrieker, a 5-mana 4/4 dragon. It's a Mardu card. It has flying. It says when it enters, it deals 2 damage to any target, you gain 2 life, and if a player was dealt damage this way, they discard a card. So Sonic Shrieker seems like a limited bomb, but we don't really talk about limited. So why are we talking about this card? Well, if you think about what it is, it's essentially ETB as a Lightning Helix version of Shock. And if you hit your opponent, you kind of get a Hopeless Nightmare out of it too. Probably not good enough for Constructed, but what if we're playing a narrative deck? This is the one reason I'm kind of hyped about this card. Imagine there's some sort of narrative Mardu Dragon deck. You play narrative, the next turn you follow up with Sonic Shrieker. Its ETB is essentially going to deal 4 damage because it's narrative. So 4 damage to your opponent, you gain 2 life, and they discard a card, and you get a 4/4 flyer. That actually seems like a pretty big swing in your favor, so we'll see if it actually takes off, but it seems interesting enough to mention at least. Speaking of interesting uncommon dragons, we also got Twin Maw Stormbrood. So it's a Omen dragon. It's Dragon Side, a 6-mana white 5/4 flyer that when it enters, you gain 5 life. The exciting part is its Omen mode, Charring Bite. So for 1 and a red, at sorcery speed, you deal 5 damage to target creature without fly. So Twin Maw Stormbrood, its removal mode is quite literally Roast, which was kind of a chase removal spell last time we were in Tarkir, so kind of a nice callback there. And then its Dragon mode is like a better Bulwark Giant. Not that Bulwark Giant's a playable card, but because it's attached to a removal spell, I think that Twin Maw Stormbrood might actually be. When you consider that in our current standard format, dealing 5 damage to a creature already costs 2 mana, there's not really much of a tax here. I know like Witchtalker's Frenzy in scenarios can cost 1 mana, but 2 mana at sorcery speed, 5 damage to a creature is already kind of like a fine rate. So I can imagine some sort of control deck where you play this card as a removal spell, and then later in the game you draw it and you got a bunch of mana and you're like, okay, I'll cast it and get this reasonably big flyer, gain back some life. So I think the flexibility of the removal mode into Big Dragon later might be enough for this to see play in some sort of dragon deck or some sort of control style shell. We also got a great green sideboard card in Heritage Reclamation. So 1 in a green instant, you choose 1, blow up an artifact, blow up an enchantment, or exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard, and you draw a card. And those 3 last words are what makes this card, because we have seen Return to Nature in the not that distant past, which is literally the exact same card, except it doesn't say draw a card on the exile target card from a graveyard mode. And this card's already been like close to sideboard playable. And I think adding draw a card, which does make this strictly better. I know strictly better is always like a weird term in Magic where people are gonna be like, well, actually, maybe there's an Orcish Bowmasters and I don't want to draw a card. But this is literally the definition of strictly better. It's the same exact effect, but you get a little bit more value out of it. And that little bit more value, I think, turns this from kind of a okay fringe sideboard card into a very good sideboard card. One of the cards I love most in my sideboards in Standard is Paw Patch Formation. I also play quite a bit of Cease Desist, and the reason that I can play these cards is because they cycle themselves. So Paw Patch Formation, it can never be that bad, right? If your opponent has a big flyer, it's insane. If they have a great enchantment, it's amazing. If your opponent's got nothing else going on, well, 2 mana, I draw a new card, try to find something more relevant. Same with Cease Desist. The 6 mana mode's ridiculous if you get to it against like Zur Overlords or whatever, but you can always just cycle it for 2 mana with the Cease mode, and I think that's what makes Heritage Reclamation so incredibly good. It's essentially a return to nature, but it's a return to nature with its floor being raised way higher, because even in the matchups where you bring this in out of your sideboard against a deck with artifacts or enchantments, there's going to be times when you just don't need to blow up an artifact artifact or enchantment, knowing that you can always just cycle it for 2 mana drastically changes the power level of this card. So Heritage Reclamation, we'll see how it does against actual Paw Patch Formation. Maybe Paw Patch Formation is still just better than it, but I think this card, at least in Standard, should be a really good sideboard option. And it might actually not be that far away from showing up in like Pioneer sideboards, maybe even Modern sideboards. So very, very solid card. We also got a new dragon enchantment in Teeming Dragonstorm. So a 4-mana white enchantment. When it enters, you make 2/2/2 white soldier creature tokens. And then when a dragon enters under your control, you get to bounce it back to your hand. So Teeming Dragonstorm, this one's very fridge. Admittedly, out of all the lower rarity cards we've talked about today, this is probably the one least likely to actually see Standard play. But we've seen in the past 4 mana to make 2/2/2s, Geese's Bidding, Talron's Invocation, Call the Cavalry. It's not that far away from being good. We do have a lot of token synergies in Standard. Maybe if you got dragons and like New Elspeth to double the tokens, maybe you can build an engine out of this. The fact that you can bounce it back to your hand, it's in the right colors, is the new 3-mana Stax Dragon that shuts down artifacts and creatures' abilities. Maybe there's something there. So I think it's close enough to be worth keeping in mind, although I would not be at all surprised if this ended up being just a limited only card, but it could be the engine to a pretty spicy deck if it worked out. We also got a commander mana rock in Dragonstorm Globe. So Dragonstorm Globe, 3-mana artifact, says each dragon you control enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and it taps to make a mana of any color. So normally, I'm not a huge fan of 3-mana mana rocks, although I like 3-mana mana rocks that have an upside, and I feel like in a dragon deck, Dragonstorm Globe might actually have enough upside to be worth playing. I like that it triggers on any dragon that enters, so this sticks out, and it's essentially just a static +1/+1 buff to every dragon you play after. It's a metallic mimic that is on a mana rock, and then you also get to make some mana out of it, so if I'm playing Dragon or Miram or something, I think this card is at least in the conversation for one of my ramp slots. I don't really expect it to see Standard play, but you never know in a dragon deck. We also got a new removal spell in Static Snare. So Static Snare is exactly the kind of removal spell that I hate in our current Standard format. It's a 5-mana enchantment with flash, except it costs 1 less to cast for each attacking creature, and then when it enters, you can exile target artifact or creature an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. So why do I hate this card? Because it is the exact kind of card that Wizards keep spreading that powers up the beanstalk. So we have seen it Standard, Leyline Binding, Ride's End be just 4 of main deck staples in Up the Beanstalk decks because they're removal spells that you can usually cast on the cheap for 1 or 2 mana that are going to trigger your Up the Beanstalk. Static Snare kind of does the same thing. Its cost reduction is a little matchup dependent. You can't control it as well as a Leyline Binding or even a Ride's End, so it's probably worse than these 2 cards. But in a Beanstalk deck, if your opponent's got like 3 or 4 creatures, this is 1 mana, get rid of your best thing, can also hit artifacts and trigger your Up the Beanstalk. So I don't know if it beats out the other options, but remember, we're going to be losing Leyline Binding before very long. We're still going to have Up the Beanstalk unless Wizards does the right thing and bans it this summer. Watsy, if you're watching this. So we're going to lose Leyline Binding. Maybe this ends up being one of the replacements in these Up the Beanstalk decks. So I don't know if this card's like revolutionary or anything, but it's a 5-mana card that you can cast for 1 mana, which means it's probably going to be good with beans. Of course, we round things out today with some draft checks that you can check out over at MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of week 1 of Tarkir Dragonstorm spoilers. So no spoilers tomorrow on the schedule, but we'll be back next week with another full week of spoilers, including on Monday, we get our exclusive MTG Goldfish preview card. So let me know what you think about all these new cards. Hopefully you enjoyed week 1 of spoilers, and I'll be back on Monday with even more Tarkir Dragonstorm spoilers. So until then, have an amazing weekend, everyone, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? We can find yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe check out yesterday's Against the Odds, where we look to push it to the limit in Standard.